Nikolai sat on the edge of his bed, listening to the strange sounds coming from the hallway. It seemed to him that each night the noise grew louder, accumulating like the echo of distant footsteps. The hospital, where he had ended up by some strange twist of fate, was not a place for rest and healing, but rather for those who had lost themselves. It was odd that he found himself here. The events of the past week seemed blurred, as if someone had intentionally clouded his memories. He remembered going to the doctor for insomnia. He recalled the nightmares that had been haunting him for months. At first, he didn't pay them much mind, but over time the nightmares became too real. Waking up at night, he couldn't tell where the dream ended and reality began. And one day he woke up in this hospital, not understanding how he had gotten here. The first thing that caught his eye was the strange looks from the staff and other patients. The doctors said little. The nurses looked at him with some hidden anxiety, and the other patients didn't leave their rooms at all, as if they were hiding from something, as though someone or something was stalking them in the hallways. Nikolai's room was on the second floor, but at night it seemed to him that there were many more floors. Sometimes heavy footsteps or quiet voices came from the walls, whispering words he couldn't make out. At first, Nikolai dismissed it as his nerves. He knew that insomnia could create hallucinations, especially after so many sleepless nights. But over time, his doubts grew. The reality of this place became more and more fragile. One night, when he could no longer bear the pressure of the unknown, he decided to leave his room and see what was happening in the hallways. He quietly opened the door and peeked out. In the dim light, only the vague outlines of walls and the silhouette of an empty nurse's cart were visible. The sounds he had been hearing seemed muffled, as if someone was deliberately concealing their presence. Nikolai stepped into the hallway. The cold floor chilled his bare feet, and he immediately felt a tingling sensation throughout his body. His intuition screamed at him to turn back, but he kept walking, driven by an inexplicable desire to uncover the truth. Each step echoed loudly in his ears, and each turn in the hallway revealed new stretches of this strange, shadow-filled place. Suddenly, he heard a faint whisper coming from a dark corner. The sound wasn't like the usual voices of the hospital staff. It was low, almost inhuman, and it seeped deeply into his mind. Nikolai stopped, listening, trying to make out the words, but all he heard was a rhythmic, hypnotic murmur. The words slithered into his brain like snakes, and he couldn't shake them. He moved forward, his steps growing slower, as though the air around him had thickened. Suddenly, a shadow flickered ahead. At the intersection of the corridors, Nikolai froze, his heart pounding. He strained his eyes, but all he could make out was movement, too fast and strange to be human. It was someone or something moving unnaturally quickly. Nikolai didn't run back to his room, even though every instinct screamed for him to do so. He turned the corner and found himself in a dark, long hallway filled with strange shapes. Medical gurneys, chairs, carts, they all seemed somehow off, as though suspended in a distorted space. His gaze suddenly locked onto a figure at the far end of the corridor. It stood still, swaying slightly, and seemed to be looking directly at him. The figure was tall and thin, its body twisted as if its joints and bones bent at unnatural angles. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Nikolai felt that it was smiling. This was no human. Pierced by cold terror, Nikolai took a step back, but his legs stopped responding. Behind him, there was a faint creak like someone had opened a door. Turning around, he saw other figures standing behind him. They were silently approaching, moving just as unnaturally as the first. Their faces were distorted, blurred in the dim light, and then it dawned on him these weren't people. In a panic, Nikolai ran in the opposite direction, but with every step, the hallway seemed to lengthen. Around him, the walls closed in, turning into a chaotic maze. The hospital seemed to be playing with him, forcing him to wander through its corridors, confronting him with new monsters. Everything was surreal and unnatural. He no longer knew what was real and what was a product of his exhausted mind. Finally, Nikolai burst into a large room filled with old hospital beds. They were all empty, but covered in dusty sheets, as if abandoned long ago. On one of the beds, he saw a human figure. It was a man in an old doctor's coat. His eyes were closed, and he looked as though he was sleeping, though his face was wrinkled with deep lines of pain. Nikolai approached cautiously, trying to get a closer look. Suddenly, the man opened his eyes and sat up sharply. His gaze was cold and lifeless. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Nikolai froze, feeling a rising terror. The man got up, his movements jerky and unnatural. He slowly reached out to Nikolai, and then he spoke just one word, quietly but with such force that it pierced Nikolai's mind. "Run." But there was nowhere to run. The creatures surrounded him on all sides. Their faces were no longer human. Their eyes were blacker than the night. Their smiles stretched into mad grins. They moved closer, slowly but inevitably. And then Nikolai realized that this place wasn't just a hospital. It was a living maze, created not for healing but for trapping souls. The hospital fed on the fear and pain of its victims, leaving them here forever to wander its corridors as shadows, empty shells lost in time. He was the next victim,